So, Dr. Alan Buckle, yes, welcome to you. I'd like you to unmute yourself and share your video, and you'll be talking about the stewardship regime. We've been going for some time now and working to those codes and guidelines, and yeah, we're all very familiar with it. So it'd be great to hear from you in what's going to be happening going forward.
Okay, so I'm going to try and share my screen now. So when I was asked to do this talk some months ago, I knew obviously what the date was, and I was wondering what to talk about. But two things were coming together at this time. The first is that we're right at the end of the 5 years of stewardship. And when we set out on stewardship, the government gave us 5 years and said it was going to review us at 5 years. So what I can tell you today is pretty much what we're going to be telling the government oversight group. And also, it's at the end of the year, so we've completed all of the monitoring programs for 2020, and that adds up to 5 years of monitoring in most of these things that we've been doing. So it's quite a good time, I think, to be looking at stewardship. I've got a lot of slides, and I will go through some of them quite quickly. And I know that if any of you want to look at them in a bit more detail, they'll be available to you after this talk. So I'm going to go to, there we are. So 5 years of stewardship and where now? Well, the answer to the where now is we're going into a 5-year review. Should have happened this year, but the government oversight group and the people who look at us from Health and Safety Executive were all incredibly busy doing other things. You can probably imagine what that was. And they suggested that we actually postpone the 5-year review, and it's been moved over into spring of 2021. So that's where we're headed. So I want to take you back to life before stewardship, and just so that you see where we set out from, I'm going to then go through a few slides. They're not very interesting slides, lots of bullet points, but I want to explain the scope of the regime and how it was built up over those 5 years. It didn't all come into operation in 2016. We had lots of work to do to develop it, and I just want to run through some of the things that we did through a timeline. So before, we had no scheme of licensing and certification for professional pest management technicians. In fact, we don't have one now. One of the first things that we all asked the Health and Safety Executive to do at the start of stewardship, we explained that we thought a licensing scheme would be very helpful to stewardship. And it was made abundantly clear to us that that wasn't the way that the government was thinking at that time. And we had to get on and do something that was more voluntary, but something that we would implement as an industry. And so that's where we were with that particular thing. There were rodenticide products that were labelled just for use by professionals, but really no formal definition of what a professional was. In those days, I think pretty much anyone who had a bit of headed notepaper could walk into a shop, and if the headed notepaper says ABC Pest Control, they were considered to be professionals. Now, what we were also faced with there is that most of the most potent second-generation anticoagulants were restricted and had been restricted for 30 years to indoors only. And that meant, because of the very strict interpretation of what indoors meant, they were just not available for rat control, used them for mice, but not for rat control. And probably not definitively, but as a result of that restriction, we couldn't use Brodifacoum, diphenthioate, and fluclomifen for resistance management. And there's no doubt that in the UK, there's more resistance mutations, there's more severe resistance, there's more widespread resistance in any other country worldwide. And in almost all of those countries, these three very potent second-generation anticoagulants were being used for rat control. Well, you can probably do the sums there. So that's where we were. And what started the whole thing going was that back in 2011, the European Commission did a review of all biocides, included rodenticides. They did them first, so they're the very first group of compounds to go through this commission process because they were particularly worried about them. They failed health assessments and they failed environmental risk assessments, and they were put up as candidates for substitution. Now, that's in fact just a polite way of saying we want to ban these as soon as possible. And so that's the starting off point. But there weren't alternatives, so they left them on the market. In 2012, BPCA published documents, environmental risk assessments, and then started a public consultation and said, well, we should be banning these, but what do you want to do with them? And there was a public consultation. Some of you might have put information into that consultation. At the end of the consultation in April, there was a big meeting up outside Liverpool. And the outcome of that was that if HSE was going to allow any ESCAR use outdoors at all, they needed to see a stewardship program in place. So that was the starting point. What then happened in 2013, I was chairing a CRRU meeting in Stanton Park. HSE asked to be invited and asked CRRU to organise this stewardship regime that everyone had decided was required. And after quite a bit of discussion, a gentleman you may remember, Mr. Jonathan Peck, stood up and addressed all of the CRRU directors and said he thought we should do it because if we didn't, who better to do it? And that's how things got started. There was a very, very long process, 2 years of negotiation, asking HSE what it wanted, pulling in all of the stakeholder groups from the three main user sectors: professional pest control, gamekeeping, and farming, and putting proposals. We had 3 rounds of proposals for HSE. We wrote reports. We went to them. First round of proposals was, the response from HSE was nowhere near. Second round, months later, getting there, but still not good enough. Third round eventually was, okay, we'll let you start. And that was the start of the stewardship regime. The key point of the whole thing was to implement proof of competence at point of sale. And for that, you've got to have proof of competence and knowing what competence means. And you have to have an ability to check that at the point of sale whenever a professional product is being sold. We published Code of Best Practice, and that led into training regime with us setting approved training courses and therefore approved certifications. Finally, in 2015, HSE published its high-level principles, which actually told us what we should be doing. And that's 2.5 or 3 years after the whole thing started. Then HSE described the targets for the reduction of wildlife exposure. And in April 2016, in effect, the scheme started. The first products came into the market that required proof of professional competence. Permanent baiting guidance was published. Then at the end of 2017 and every other year after that, CRRU writes a report as to what's happened that year, goes up in front of the government oversight group and reports what's going on. Finally, in 2017, after that first report, the government oversight group and HSE said that it thinks the regime is fit for purpose and basically gives us the go-ahead. I'm going to skip some of these bullet points. So for the first time in 2018, all of the outlets selling professional products were audited by BASIS. So this is our check, if you like, on competence checks. So every single outlet that sells a professional product has somebody from BASIS go in and make sure that their systems are in place and that they're asking everybody for proof of competence. I'll come back to these other bullet points a bit later on. But now, where we are now in 2020, the government oversight group set 2020 for the major review, but it's been postponed because of COVID to spring 2021. What also happened through 2020 because of COVID, we could do only limited resistance testing. The basis point of sale audits at first was stopped because their people couldn't go into these outlets. And then a system of remote auditing was devised and put in place. And in fact, BASIS completed all of its audits this year. We collected Barnow carcasses, and I'll tell you about that data in a moment. Our people, the Barnow is the chosen sentinel species for the environment in the UK for rodenticide stewardship. And that's why we have to look at Barnow carcasses. We also independently look at how Barnows are breeding in the UK, and I'll tell you some more about that. And we did, for the third time, a full CAP study. Now, CAP means knowledge, attitude, and practice. And this is a very extensive survey of users in the 3 user groups as to how they're getting on with understanding what's required in rodent control. And I'll get through some more of that a bit later on in the talk. And what's happening now is we're preparing all of this stuff for the 5-year report to go up for assessment by HSC and the Government Oversight Group. So for those of you who don't know how we run stewardship, this little chart explains it to you. Top in the middle is the CRRU task force, and that's got members from every single one of the stakeholder organizations, including, of course, BPCA and all of the other stakeholder groups from farming, gamekeeping, and professional pest control. It's got 6 individuals on the task force, so it's a very large group. The oversight group, the government side that plugs into the task force, the Health and Safety Executive is the chair, but there's Public Health England, DEFRA, Natural England, Science and Advice for Scottish Agriculture, and representatives from all of the devolved administration. So they're the government people looking over us. And then we work in these 6 work groups, and you can see them there: best practice, training, regulatory, point of sale, monitoring and communication. And you can see Dee Ward-Thompson of BPCA is the leader of the best practice work group. Now, every one of those work groups is populated, and all of the work that gets done in CRRU that you hear about and read about is done by volunteers that sit in those work groups, who work in the industry or in other stakeholder organizations. They've all got their own jobs to do, big jobs, stressful jobs, but they give their time independently to help us to operate the stewardship regime. So this chart, and I won't go through it all at all, is set out for us by HSC and the Government Oversight Group. And you can see down the left-hand side, there are 6 areas in which the government asks CRRU to provide monitoring information. And on the other side are the various projects that we put in place. And I put in red just some of the main ones that I'll talk about later on. But I won't go down through those now, because particularly the ones in red, I'll talk about as we go through. So one other thing happened pretty much as 2016 was kicking off, and that is the European Commission decided to do yet another review of rodenticides, and it came out with this new process whereby every single rodenticide product had to have what's called an SPC, a summary of product characteristics. You can download these from the ECHO website if you're interested in what they say. But essentially what that is, it's the letter of the law or it's the Bible from the Commission as to how products can be used that contain specific active substances. There's no deviation from this allowed, and the member state regulatory authorities are not allowed to alter what it is that the Commission says can be done with these products. And for the very first time through this process, the Commission set up this set of non-standard uses. Now, these are uses that you were all using before 2016 and were thinking were perfectly normal and usual: permanent baiting, burrow baiting, pulse baiting, and the use of alternatives to tamper-resistant bait stations, covered and protected bait points. But suddenly, those were all non-standard uses, The standard use is a tamper-resistant bait station, and authorization holders for products had to make applications to get all of those things separately put on the label. The other thing that was the big change is that in the UK, brodifenone, diphthalate, and flocoufen could be used for the first time outdoors, particularly in and around buildings. So those changes all came in at the start of stewardship. Now, the first thing I'm going to talk about, and again, with all of these monitorings, I'm going to talk quite quickly and briefly through it. I really want to explain the scope of this rather than the exact detail. And if you want to have a look at a bit more of it, all of these reports are available and published on the CRRU website, and this presentation will be as well. But what we do is a Barnow monitoring survey. The government decided that Barnows were the sentinel species, and we had to get 100 livers of 100 Barnows every year and look at residues in them. And I'll tell you more about that project in the next set of slides. But we thought we ought to do some work on how Barnows are breeding while they're carrying these residues. What you can see there for a single year are the red spots are the places where the 100 Barnow carcasses were found for the liver residue study, and the coloured boxes are where we study the breeding of Barnows, and we have done for the last 5 years. Again, much too much information on this, but what it tells us is how year on year the Barnow breeding is going, and what we see is great fluctuations in terms of how Barnows breed, principally driven by prey availability and the weather. And we suggest in no way driven by the residues that they're carrying, which are almost universally very low. What you can see at the bottom there is the number of Barnow chicks that were ringed by the British Trust for Ornithology. And you can see all of those every year. Those numbers are the new numbers of birds that fly away from Barnow nests and into the Barnow population. So this gives us a view of what Barnows are doing in terms of breeding. Another project that we're asked to provide information on is resistance to anticoagulants. And every year we ask people to send in tails from all over the country, and we sequence the DNA. And every year we build this map. There are two maps, one with the data for the year, and one is the data for the whole of the period of the study. And I said I'd tell you a bit about the seagulls. That little spot out there, that's where I'm sitting right now, a little village of Porthgain. I was in the garden a year or so ago, and a dead rat almost literally landed on my head. I looked up and a seagull had dropped it. Heaven knows where it got it. So I beat the seagull to it, snipped off its tail and sent it for analysis. And it was a fully susceptible rat in that particular circumstance. So seagulls do have their benefits every now and again. But what this shows you is the scope and the spread of resistance in the UK. There's a big bit in the middle, and we don't have very many samples from that area. And you can see those of you who are listening or watching in from these counties really need you to send in samples. But generally speaking, the black diamonds are the susceptible rats, just like this one from out here. But these are susceptible rats, and it looks as though we've got a sort of a susceptible core in the country. Lots of resistance all the way around that. We've set up a new process for resistance testing. You can find the details of it on the CRRU website. Okay, the next slide. I'm going to get through that one quite quickly. We collect very few mouse tails, and we want mice just as much as we want rats. But what you can see there is the map that we have at the moment for mice resistance. And if you look at the numbers down the side, we've only had so far 93 mouse tails sent to us. But of those, nearly 94% are resistant and 60% are homozygous resistant. That means they got a gene for resistance from both mum and dad, and that means they're very resistant indeed. And it really does explain that house mice are extremely resistance is very prevalent in house mice in the UK. So I'm going to come on to talk about the Barnow residues. And the government set out targets for us to deliver in 2017. And I'm going to read these because they're quite important. Within the expected long-term downward trend, any significant increase observed in the exposure to the sum and any individual SCAR active substance on a yearly basis will be considered. Monitoring will continue through the lifetime of the rodenticide stewardship regime. Changes to the rodenticide stewardship regime may result if the above are not met. So this is a typical set of Barnow livers that we get 100 per year. They go off, their livers are removed, SCARs are extracted, and the concentrations are worked out. I won't go into the details of this, but there are government ecotoxicologists that look at this data and they decide whether the residues are going up and down. And what you can see there is the data for the three main SCARs that are most widespread in Barnows: bromadiolone, difenacoum, and brodifacoum. And there you can see the percentage of Barnows that are detected with these SCARs over the years of the stewardship regime through to 2019. And what you can see is not much difference. We still don't quite understand what's going on with difenacoum there. It might be that you folks can tell me that some of you might have stopped using difenacoum. I doubt that very much, but I don't understand why it is that difenacoum is low. You can see the baseline on the extreme left of those graphs is the accumulation of 4 years worth of data before stewardship started. So we got that data, and it's against that baseline that we compare all of these residues. Much more scientific assessment is done, but the bottom line in all of this is that residues are really not moving very much. So we've been doing stewardship for 5 years, and the bad news is that we haven't got the residues down. The good news is that they haven't gone up either. So the big change to put brodifacoum, difethylene, flocoufen outdoors, everyone was very worried, certainly in the regulatory organisation was very worried that this would cause a sudden increase in these active substances. That's not happened. So that's the good news and the opposite, if you wish. So that's all I was going to say on the Barnow livers. We also keep a track on how many certifications are being issued through CRRU approved schemes, and you can see that's the data for the 5 years. It's been steadily declining year on year, and I think we're going to get to a baseline level of new certificates and qualifications. But obviously at the start, when we implemented this requirement for proof of competence, lots of people didn't have qualifications or certificates, and they got through these courses pretty quickly. But altogether, 27,500 new certificates from these 4 CRRU-approved awarding organisations: RSPH, BASIS, Sitting Guilds, and Lantra. One of the big things that we did was to bring all of the farm assurance schemes on board, and I know this is a contentious area. But what we decided was that the best way to get farming on board of stewardship is to embed the CRRU Code of Best Practice in the standards for all of these farm assurance schemes, and have the auditors go onto all of these farms once a year or once every 18 months at the least, and audit to the CRRU Code of Best Practice to ensure that that best practice is being applied on these farm assurance schemes. So what I was going to go through now are some of the outputs from the CAP survey, the Knowledge, Attitudes and Practice survey that we've been doing. You can see that we did one in 2015. That was before stewardship started. We did one in 2017, halfway through. and we did one this year, and reports just come out. Lots and lots of questions, about 50 questions answered by hundreds of participants in our 3 user groups. And you can see some emerging trends, I would say. I've just pulled out a very tiny bit of the data from this, and just to quickly run through a few slides. So a question: do you have a formal qualification relating wholly or in part to rodenticide use? And you can see the numbers there for farmers, gamekeepers, and professional pest control. You can see right at the start we were up at 96, and now we're at 99 for the people in professional pest control. You can see the jump from 37 to 60 in gamekeeping, and then up to 81 in gamekeeping. And this is almost all to do with a course that we set up for gamekeepers, specifically with gamekeeping organisations, so that they could get competent. And you can see farmers have less formal certifications. So we asked about CPD schemes and who is members of CPD schemes, and you can see there the numbers. And once again at the bottom, there seems to be an increase amongst PCOs in membership of CPD schemes. Also increases in the other 2 user groups, but not to the same extent. This is a question about what was the last or latest brand of rodenticide that you used? Do you know what brands you use? And you can see at the top there, something like 30 or 40% of farmers don't know the brand they use. And I think looking at the bottom, PCOs, you can see that when we started, 38% said they didn't know the brand. But now in 2020, we're down to a very small number amongst PCOs. Still quite a lot of work to do on that amongst these other user groups. Another question, by the way, do you know the active ingredient in the chosen brand? Particularly, for example, if you're wanting to do resistance management, it's incredibly important that you know something about the active ingredient. And you can see, once again, PCOs lead the way there. This is the last one I'm going to show you. It's about the employment. Do you employ permanent baiting? That's putting bait down all year round. And you can see there across all of the user groups a very significant decline in the use of permanent baiting. And we believe that it's that practice, permanent baiting particularly, that is contaminating wildlife. So that's a good sign for CRRU, obviously, so long as there are good alternatives to permanent baiting being put into practice. I'm going to skip that one because I need to get to the end. So where are we? This major review, at the start of stewardship, HSE gave us 5 years. The review was delayed. At the moment, we don't know the procedure as to how this review is going to be done, and we're in discussion with HSE to find out more about that. But the wording of the government's report after the first year is depending on the outcome of the above, and that was all of those requirements that I've explained about liver residues and other things. Changes could range from minor modification to the rodenticide stewardship regime, improved training awareness, changes to approved uses, amendment of approval of specific products, or revocation of uses and products. So basically, that's what they're saying might happen as a result of this review. We're doing our own review of what we've achieved, and the first point about decrease in Barnow liver residues has not been achieved. It's been pretty flat. It talks about a downward trend. They're worried about any increases. Well, there was no increase. The monitoring has happened. The threat is changes and more regulation of what's going on. The CRRU view is that we haven't had enough time to make these things work properly. So where now? 2018 was actually the very first year when all of the elements of stewardship were in full operation. All the training courses were following CRRU principles. All purchases had to be supported by proof of competence. All the major farm insurance schemes audits had been completed, and all the sales audits were completed. And so that's going on and has gone on in 2021. Only time is going to tell if we've done enough when we go up in front of HSE. What if we haven't? Well, we think there may be more restrictions on who can use rodenticides, how they're used, where they're applied. Even a complete ban on escars and only use of physical methods, that's been talked about. And obviously there's this new active substance coming in, co-calciferol, and how that fits in the whole process is going to be interesting as well. I think that's a bit of a rush through. I hope I haven't gone through too far through that, but you will be able to have a look at this presentation at some stage if you wish to do that. I'm hoping I've left enough space for some questions. Natalie, over to you.
Hi there, Alan. Thank you so much for that. If you can just stop sharing your screen, that would be great, and then we can get on some questions. Yeah, we've got half a dozen there, so good stuff. I'll read them out to you in the best way that I can that's understandable. So someone's mentioned about Lincolnshire, and there seems to be very little information on resistance there. Is there a reason?
Yes. Well, that's absolutely true. It's a big blank, and if there's anyone listening in from Lincolnshire, we would love to get some rat and some mouth tails from there. So please do send them in. You can go onto the CRRU website and you can find out where to send them, how to collect them, how to parcel them up, and how to send them. And people are sitting at the APHA office down in Newhall, all raring to go to do this work. So we just need the tails, and we never have enough. So please don't think you're going to swamp us. You won't. Send some from Lincolnshire, Nottinghamshire, Northampton. Nothing from Northamptonshire. There's loads of counties in the Midlands, and it may be that's because people aren't really encountering resistance problems there. And so they're not thinking, well, I've got resistance, so I'm not sending a tail. And it may be there isn't resistance there because the tails we do get show that they're susceptible rats, but it would be really good to get that confirmed. So, yeah.
Great, fabulous. Well, what I'll do is I'll try and find a link and put it in the chat section so that people can get a direct link to the website where you mentioned.
Please do.
The next question was similar, really, but Guy mentioned that anonymous question here about they're in Scotland and there seem to be requiring more samples there. So again, the same thing. I'm assuming you'd like samples from there.
Absolutely, yes, please. It's clear from the maps where the gaps are. We've got loads of tails from the south of England. It's because we're based at the University of Reading. And so people get to know about us and send stuff in. But Wales, there's not much from Wales, not much from Scotland, nothing from Northern Ireland, lots of missing places in England as well. So very keen to get that. Great.
I'll find a link and I'll get it in there to the chat section if Scott hasn't already. The next two questions are pretty similar to each other. So it says, hi, Alan, is there any hope that all rodenticides will be professional use only and the retail sector will be stopped from selling rodenticides to non-professionals and the general public?
Well, that was a question that we asked when Stewardship started, and the government and HSE decided that it wouldn't require the imposition of stewardship on these, what I call them, the old speak is amateur use. It's now called general public use. They decided that they felt that the scope of that use, the amount of that use, the volume of rodenticides that go through that channel is relatively small in comparison with the volumes that go through the other three main user groups. And HSE decided that they didn't want us to steward that general public use. And we had what we thought was such a vast task to get on top of all of these other use patterns and use groups that we were not upset about not being asked to handle general public at that stage. Now, when this review happens, that I'm certain is something that that the regulatory authority, HSE, will consider. But As to what they will decide, I can't guess.
Yeah, absolutely. No, good answer. Got a question about the Barnow residues, and big question just popped up and it got rid of my last one. There we go. So if the Barnow residues are stable and the use of permanent baiting has reduced, does this not contradict the view that permanent baiting is the issue?
Very, very possibly. What's been happening is these changes have been taking place relatively slowly, as you could see from the graphs that we put up. And there is a lag in these biological systems because these substances sit around for some while in the system. So what we're going to be saying to the health and safety executive is, although stewardship started in 2016, it really wasn't fully implemented until 2018, even 2019. And there's a biological delay in this system. So please, we need some more time to see what's going on. But I take the point about permanent baiting. If it isn't that, we're going to have to try to find out what else it is. And I suspect some of the people listening are going to be saying it's the general public use. But I have heard that a few times.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. A new question. So hopefully this it might be a trickier one, but we'll see how we go. How will the new cholecalciferol products affect risk hierarchy?
Yeah, we haven't. So CRRU is just about to put out a new code of best practice, and your colleague Dee Thompson is working hard on that. It's going to be out just in the new year. We haven't had that conversation in the CRRU best practice work group yet. So it's yet to be decided where it fits. But what I can say is that the European Commission has issued what's called an implementing directive. And that's a document which implements the ability for that product to be distributed in the EU. And in that document is a clear statement from the Commission that it's the Commission's view that cholecalciferol carries fewer human health and environmental risks than escars. So that is a pretty big prompt to CRRU where it's going to sit in the risk hierarchy. But I'm afraid it's a watch this space. We need to give it careful consideration. We will put out a new code of best practice which will explain it all pretty soon in the new year.
Great, good stuff. So I've got a nice long observation and then a question as well here, Alan. So I'll read it out as competently as I can. So it's from Mike Ayres. So he says, Barnows are, of course, our interest and a good method of sampling exposure to escars, but they only represent the exposure in rural communities. My experience, i.e. Mike's experience, is that the use of toxic bait outside has plummeted, but most of this is in semi-rural to urban environments, in industrial rather than agricultural settings. So the survey is skewed towards farmers, gamekeepers. These are probably the least controlled and might explain the lack of movement. Mike believes there needs to be tighter control in these groups. Mike's other point is the analytical data. Escars have a long half-life in the mammalian, I just said that correctly, and again, systems, and this may have an impact on the survey data. The levels detected at the nanogram quantity would seem to be going down to the limits of the detection methods, where I believe the detection error is as much as 20 to 30 ng. Is this correct? Hopefully I've read, if the question is all there for you to have a read, but
yeah, I'm afraid if I try to read that, I'm looking at this on a tiny laptop screen. I'll have to stuff my face in the screen if I'm going to read anything. I'm afraid that was so long, Natalie. The first question's pretty much gone out of my mind. But what I can say, and I do understand the urban-rural discussion. The government oversight group is full of scientists and ecotoxicologists. And they will look at this, and they will look at what we've managed to change and what we haven't managed to change from the CAT survey. It clearly shows where the movement is and where it's not. I don't like pointing the fingers, but those bar charts fingers pointing from left to right on the bar charts point the finger pretty clearly. So all of the thing that your very accurate questionnaire put there will be considered when this data goes up. And the fact that we have got a flat line on barn owls and we've made some changes, all of that will have to be taken into consideration, and there will need, I'm sure the government oversight group will look at what it thinks might need to change going into the second 5-year plan of stewardship, if you like.
Yeah. Absolutely.
I honestly don't know if I can pick out the question and whether I answered it there, but hopefully I did. All I can say is if any of those people want to put these questions to me, they can find my email address pretty easily. So I'd be happy to answer on email.
That'd be great. I'm glad you offered that up rather than me offering it for you and then feeling like I was putting you on the spot there. So that's great. Well, that was the last one of our questions. So again, like you've said, if people want to email you, you're happy for that, and also with us, we're happy to talk about it. So great. I really appreciate that, Alan. Thank you so much.
Okay. Well, thanks for everyone. I know it was a rush through, but I just wanted to sort of explain the scope of the whole thing and touch on parts of it. And hopefully, if people want to know more, there's plenty of information on the CRRU website on all of that.
That's it. It's difficult to cover everything that you do and that's relevant right now in a 40-minute slot or so. So yeah, done very well with that. Great. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you.